Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm your host, Lauren Steiner, and as you can tell, my voice is a little hoarse. I've got three guests with me to talk about Charlottesville and how Trump is enabling fascism and what we can do about it. I have Xochitl Johnson. Xochitl is an organizer with Refuse Fascism Bay Area, and she has been on the front lines of protests for 20 years. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on your show.
And with Xochitl, I also have Chrystal Keshawarz, who is an organizer for United for Love 2 rally, which means there was a United for Love 1 rally, which we'll talk about. She's also a poet, a writer, and a founding member of Kalbu Mariam's Women's Mosque. So I hope I said all those things correct.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, Kalbu Mariam is up in Berkeley.
My next guest is Zak Wear. And Zak is an organizer for the Richmond Progressive Alliance. And he most recently worked as a campaign manager for Measure L, which made Richmond the first new rent control city in over 30 years. Yay! And Zak is also the campaign manager for Jovanka Beckles, who is my candidate for Assembly District 15 up in Northern California. I met Xochitl at Occupy inauguration. Some of you may have seen my live stream from there. I got involved I was on the permitted march and everything was peaceful. And then I saw a guy with dreadlocks and he was ushering us away down one street and away from another street. And I said, "What's going on up there?" And he said, "You don't want to go up there." I said, "Oh, is there action up there?" And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I want to go up there." And I got in between the Antifa Black Bloc and the cops. And the Antifa Black Bloc were lobbing rocks over my head at the cops, and the cops were lobbing tear gas at Antifa. I then went to another street where I encountered Xochitl. And this is the conversation that we had.
Tell us what your chant is about.
Trump and Pence are fascists. Trump and Pence are illegitimate. They're fascists because of what they want to bring into power. They want to curb civil liberties so that we can't even come out here. Pence has a law in his state where you could remove protesters from the streets by any means necessary. How scary is that? What kind of violence are they trying to bring down about the state? Already Trump has threatened to strip the citizenship of people who burn the flag, symbols of this country. That is protected speech. If we don't have protected speech, and we have nothing, and that means we have to take to the streets and fight right now. What else is fascist? Are you going to tell me that rounding up people based on their religion is not the very definition of fascism? You're going to tell me that building walls and targeting certain minorities just based on their nationality is not the very definition of fascism? Their law and order plan to round up even more black people, to give the police even more powers to murder and maim and assault and even more men in this country, black men, brown men. And what about women? What about black men, brown men, brother, indigenous nation, Latino? What about women? We're not allowed to have control over our bodies. That again, definition of fascism. We can't decide if we're going to have a baby or not. Somebody else is going to decide. A man is going to decide. We can't have health care in this country, but people are here worried about a limousine getting in the face. I do not give a goddamn. This is a fight for our lives while we can fight. I like to remind people as I spit in your face and talk that the time difference between Hitler coming into power in January of 1933 and the establishment of Dachau was 3 months. January to March. Do not play around with these people. So that's why I'm out here calling this fascism, and that's why I'm out here calling it illegitimate.
I was told that there's a group called Antifa, which organized these protests. They're an anti-fascist group that started in Europe after the Nazis.
There's a lot of people out here, answers out here. I think the Antifa, the Muslims, and the pro-Palestine movement. I mean, to me, this is a cause, right, that brings everybody together in a lot of different streams. Yeah, maybe there's some COINTELPRO, but the idea that any time young people commit acts of violence, that it's the state is just ridiculous. Look around the world. Right now in Mexico, the youth are fighting. Right now in all over parts of the world, the youth are always going to fight because they have nothing else. They have no other voice. They don't have any money. They can't fly all around the world. They can pick up a brick, they can smash a window, and they're going to do it. And they're impatient, and maybe they don't have the politics or whatever to know that we can organize and do all those those kind of things. But I'll tell you what, I'd rather have them around me fighting for me if I'm in trouble than a bunch of liberals that are going to tell me they're going to call their congressman. I believe that it's going to take a lot of different kinds of protests, from vigils, from church people, from scientists, from librarians to students, to all these people in the streets holding ground and not giving it up. If we can create a movement that can occupy the streets like Occupy, that can bring people together like Standing Rock, that can have the fierceness like Ferguson, and bring all the different streams of our peoples together, women, queers, people of color, the immigrants, whatever.
Yeah.
The people of the fucking country, basically.
Yeah.
That is who is going to suffer under this. Then we will win, right?
Yes.
That was 8 months ago. Now Trump has had 8 months to do his dirty work. What do you think now?
That was about 8 months ago, in the middle of some pretty intense protest. And where do I think we are now, 8 months later? And am I as freaked out now as I was then? And maybe I'm not in the middle of the streets, but I think I'm more freaked out. Everything that people who came out those days thought was going to come to pass has come to pass. He make no mistake, this guy he's not stupid. They have an agenda. They've been enacting it. People who say that Trump hasn't accomplished anything are completely mistaken. This has been a juggernaut of reaction and repression that we've never seen before in this country, in the sense of the rollback. Maybe not since the Reconstruction could we compare the kind of rollback of civil rights and things that we've seen in this country happen, from the gag rule that will literally kill thousands of women around the world because they won't have access to reproductive rights, to the things that I touched on there. But he did go through with all those things. That first day in office, he signed the gag rule, and then after that, it's been taking the ICE roundups to an entire new level. Now we're at the precipice of nuclear war, and then it was building up the law and order state and bringing more criminalization down on the heads of Black folks. I mean, everything that we said was going to happen has happened, right? And it's just the beginning. And so the very cause that we were out there for today is, to me, even more so. And the fact that someone was murdered in the streets yesterday, it's not surprising. This is the entire platform that he ran on. It's the white supremacy and reaction that he unleashed, that has been latent in this country, but has been completely green lighted. And now they have free reign to obviously kill people in the Bay Area. In August, there are two coming white supremacist fascist gatherings, one in Chrystal Field in San Francisco and another in Berkeley. These are, the Bay Area of all places has been a bastion of liberal ideas, right? Of resistance and politics. The fact that they can gather there, that they can bring those kind of numbers, to me, it should be alarming to anybody. I believe what I said then, and I believe it's even more necessary now. We have to take to the streets and we have to fight back.
Okay, Chrystal, your thoughts?
Absolutely. I completely concur with you. I agree. I was there on April 15th in Berkeley, and I saw with my own eyes police standing like this while white supremacist KKK neo-Nazis were hurling weapons, funneling weapons into their ranks, right under the police's watch. I mean, there's a reason why there are slogans such as cops and the KKK, they basically go hand in hand, right? So, I mean, when we talk about white supremacy, when we talk about incidents like what happened in Charlottesville, we have to admit the very real reality that the first police in this country were slave catchers, okay? And that is the root of what we're dealing with. And when we study the root, we can understand the symptoms today. I mean, why didn't this police stop this violence? Think about that. Why were they just allowing things of this nature to occur? I mean, it's as if they wanted this to happen, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I know that you have some thoughts about this predating Trump, which I agree with you. But I would like to have Zak weigh in right now on your thoughts about where Trump has taken us in this particular regard over the last 8 months, and specifically about what happened yesterday.
Well, Lauren, so, in the past 8 months, I've been, as many other people, extraordinarily anxious and fearful and angry and stressed, really about the concept that a fascist right wing is ascendant to become an organized political force of some kind, or to form a political party. And
We're already there.
when I saw the events of Charlottesville, it was kind of odd. I had as horrifying as it is, I had kind of the opposite reaction to it that I expected, which is the realization that these fascist organizers have failed to produce the results that they need in order to establish effective nationwide organizing to actually establish a fascist identified party or movement. And so, make no mistake that I'm not saying this to say that Trump does not have power, that Trump does not have fascism laden throughout him and his culture and his politics, but that within the Republican Party, there is real divisions and distinctions between explicit fascists, neo-Nazis, KKK, and skinheads, along with conservatives or libertarians. And so I think there's a lot of very interesting dynamics to talk about here. So I don't want to try to go through the whole thesis, but bottom line, I think with the fact that this national rally called Unite the Right 2017 only amassed 500 fascists from across the country, I think really demonstrated a pathetic and anemic show of organization and power to actually try to organize the overthrow of constitutional democracy.
I want to get reaction from you and Xochitl, so I'm going to drop out myself right now and let you both react. I do want to come back and talk about why the police didn't intervene, some things I read about the alt-light versus the alt-right, the neo-Nazis, and the division on the right, an excellent article which I will post in the comments, and talk about the role of the ACLU and could this have been prevented.
First of all, I want to say that I'm excited to be on with other organizers and activists. I think there's a lot of discrepancy right now about what the problem is and what the solution is. And to me, that's the central question, because if we don't actually get at what the problem is, then we're going to come at the solution in various ways that I feel are ineffective. There was a lot of controversy early on when we first called out what we could see was the beginnings of a fascist government. Why call it that? Are we being premature and alarmist? And the point being is that when you can see the earmarks of fascism, like I was agitating about in the video, you don't want to wait until those things are consolidated, right? Because once fascism is consolidated, well, you can't resist it, right? And so we need to identify those parts that really tell us what we're doing, and that's what's happened, right? And so what we have, unfortunately, are lots of folks who still have quite a lot of illusion in this idea of constitutional democracy, for instance, or democratic government. And if I have to be the far left on here, I will be. But the reality is that's not what's happening here. And whether or not you agree or disagree that that's been happening at all ever, the point being is that right now we are in a situation where, look, there's not going to be an impeachment, folks. The investigation by Robert Mueller isn't going to yield the kind of results that we need. There's not going to be scandal. The Russia scandal isn't going to bust open and then call for an end to Trump and Pence. I went to a forum with John Dean, who folks may remember from the Nixon administration, who blew the whistle, and Malcolm Nance. And John Dean was very precise in that it was about 900 days from Watergate break-in until resignation. And that's resignation. You have to resign. This isn't something that's happening in the near future. And the reality is that we don't have until the midterm elections. If you look around at what's happening, lives are in the balance, right? And if they are allowed to appoint judges, if they're allowed to change laws, if they're allowed to continue rounding people up, I mean, setting precedent of banning an entire people, like they did day one, that should be your first alarm. And if you're not hearing that, then to me, I think there's something wrong with folks with receptors. They have banned an entire religion of people. We should all be out in the streets right now and not pretending that there's going to be some legislative resolution. And and I'm sorry, and folks that think that way, I feel like they're not really in touch with the reality that people experience. I'm Black, and folks here are from different nationalities, but as a Black person in this country, I know very well and up close that this government, there's no laws that they are beholden to respect me with, and that Black people can be murdered with no justice whatsoever. And we see that day in and day out. I don't live in a world where I have belief that there's recourse, that there's democratic rule of law, where there's due process. That stuff doesn't exist for me. And it doesn't exist for most of the communities that we can see that are being affected. And I think that folks that are sort of occupying a more kind of liberal-minded position, which is great, the more the merrier, to me, it would be helpful for folks to take a look really closely at the experience of other communities. There was a question on Lauren's site about Antifa, and how dare they bring shields and masks and protect themselves from police violence, right? As if that was wrong, right? That you should just allow the police to hose you down and tear gas you and document you for so that they can round you up. And now the doxing is happening. So the right wing is doxing folks, and so kids are wearing masks, which frankly is a really smart thing. But what I posed to the folks that were writing that is, in the 1960s and early 70s, the Black Panthers were Antifa. They caused hysteria amongst white people and liberals. Back then, the American Indian movement was Antifa. Probably the Brown Berets. At any moment in this society where there are folks that are standing up to resistance and they're willing to hold their ground and defend themselves, those folks are called the problem, and they're blamed for the repression that comes down against them. And look, I'm not part of Antifa. That's not the strategy I think we need, right? But I'm going to defend them, because that same ideological justification for repression against them is going to be used against me and all of the rest of the left that steps forward.
I would like to go to Chrystal for her response.
To Zak's point about the fascists being anemic, I would say that they're certainly not anemic. In fact, every time they go into an area where there is very little resistance, they claim victory, and then their propaganda spreads from the internet to their, to their own groups. They post on message boards, on private groups, on Facebook, on Twitter, and they use the power of social media to unite themselves. Just like Trump is using the power of the social media to bypass, the American media. These alt-right fascists, and trust me, the alt-right, that's a terrible term. They're Nazi, neo-Nazi fascists, and they're KKK, and we shouldn't be referring to them by some made-up lovely name that they created to rebrand themselves. But they go from city to city, and they attempt to terrorize, citizens in their own homes. I've seen this with my own eyes in Cudahy and Maywood and Huntington Park, where they attempt to come in and defund these cities, which have been declared as sanctuary cities, by proposing things like a utility tax, right? Well, what does that utility tax do? It defunds the city and removes all the protections that those citizens have against ICE coming in and basically destroying their communities. So to say that, they're anemic, I strongly beg to differ. I've seen with my own eyes that they are very strong, they are united, they have a strong communication system in place, they are backed by the government, the police forces are mostly on their side, and I'm not saying 100% they are, because in Cudahy, we did see an instance of the police protecting citizens from, these infiltrators, but those instances are few and far between. And in many communities of color, they feel that the police are the ones terrorizing their communities. And so, you know, this white supremacist wing, it's not just some random farmers in some back country. These are your neighbors. These are people you know that you work with. These are people in government. These are people in high seats of power. And these are random crazies on the street who will ram their car into a crowd full of people. And let me also mention, this is not something that is an isolated incident. What happened in Charlotte has happened in cities across the country. I have an activist that I work with out here in the Inland Empire who was at a Black Lives Matter rally in Riverside recently, and a car ran her over from the street, just some random hit and run. When we see them online typing things like, you should just run them over, you should just get rid of them. I mean, this is an actual call to action. This is not like, you know, oh, let's have some angry sentiments. These words have weight and meaning.
Zak, based on what these guys just said, do you think that maybe we're coming to minimize this in the way that you said about whether they're going to have an organized party or not? You know, when I did in the pre-interview with you, I said they don't need an organized party because whoever their party head would be, he's already in the White House. So, I mean, do you think that maybe we're coming from a place of white privilege here to be able to analyze it in this way that you have?
I think it's a really valid critique, and you know, I also want to acknowledge, you know, Chrystal, like, you know, 95% of what you just said, I am completely with you on it. You know, I completely agree that, you know, these fascist organizers are terrorizing communities. They are impacting people's lives in very deep and harmful ways and traumatizing ways that can last the rest of their lives or kill them. You know, I mean, that is horrific. And that said, you know, I want to stay really focused on, you know, the point that I want to focus on is that I am skeptical that a viable nationalist, socialist, or Nazi party or otherwise explicitly branded fascism is going to form a national political party that can actually amass tens of millions of members.
It's called the Republican Party.
So I mean, it would probably be good to like shift a bit into like the concept of branding, right? And this, you know, alt-right versus, light, alt-light, right? If you talk with rank and file conservatives, while Republicans in the polling it's appalling in terms of their ideological attitudes. I think, you know, we recently saw not a particularly strong poll, but still a scientific survey on Republicans that 50% logged that they would be in favor of postponing the 2020 presidential election if Donald Trump and the Republican Congress were to recommend it, right? That's clearly a fascist sentiment. You know, that said, if you talk with rank and file conservatives about, you know, do you identify with neo-Nazism? You know, do you identify with the KKK? And the overwhelming reaction is no, they do not identify with those brands. And so the point I'm here to make is that those brands are showing a lack of viability. And right now, the dominant brand and identity of this conservative base still remains the Republican Party. And so when I see guys like Richard Spencer go up and give public speeches, I actually see them as very ineffective speeches. You know, as a communications researcher, I see Richard Spencer give, you know, like cliche speech cadence. He doesn't tell personal stories. You know, it's like, I don't see, when I watch these alt-right rallies and when I watched the rally in Charlottesville, I saw a lot of, frankly, confused and rambling messaging that's not necessarily pointing their movement into a specific direction. You know, rather it seems to be, you know, as you referenced earlier on social media, this much more kind of like distributed meme, you know, centered, you know, kind of amalgamous set of attitudes, right? And that's, you know, so again, you know, it's not to diminish the concept that they are a threat, but I think I did feel a shift in my vision. I was expecting to see a rally of 5,000 or 10,000 Nazis and white supremacists, you know, out there. If I were thinking in terms of their annual national rally, their biggest event, right? You know, so another way to think of it is in terms of like high watermarks, right? I think we can all, you know, acknowledge in terms of, you know, people out in the streets, the highest watermark among liberals and progressives and the left generally was the Women's March early this year. But this rally to unite the right in 2017 attracted only 500 people, and there were more than double that many in counter protesters. And so just as for sake of reference, in Topeka, the Women's March rallied over 3,000 people. And the inauguration itself was an anemic inauguration of only about 250,000, coming to see Trump. And so I think we need to, take that kind of seriously in terms of, just the reality check of, like, on a very practical level, how many people are they turning out? How many people are we turning out? And who is actually in the more effective position to organize political power at this stage?
I feel that the media, as usual, is getting it wrong. I mean, they're basically focusing on Trump and what he didn't say. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I heard them talk about how he ad-libbed this line about all sides, that the violence has to stop on all sides. And they're fixating on that because he doesn't use the word white nationalist or white supremacist or even domestic terrorism, which his own daughter, Ivanka, apparently tweeted out. So the media is part of this whole, as people who follow my show know, this whole deep state Democratic Party coup to try to impeach Trump. Now, I do think that Trump should be impeached because I think he's mentally ill and I think he's dangerous, but I think he should be impeached under the emoluments clause for all his interests that he has, his financial interests with foreign governments. But that said, I feel what they're trying to do, this collusion with Russia, that Russia hacked our election, and on the way they're trying to go about impeaching Trump is wrong, because I think what they've done is they've fomented another Cold War with Russia, which isn't even a major power anymore. I think that they're focusing on Trump and what you're going to label this without focusing on the ramifications for the American people in the communities, how this has emboldened people. Even David Duke from the Ku Klux Klan basically came out and said that you made this possible, Mr. President. And, they're out there, they're not wearing their hoods anymore. They're out there, with Sperry.
Wearing red hats.
Yeah, and polo shirts, So whatever their branding is, I don't care. I still think the actions and the ramifications are very dangerous. And I wanted you to speak to that, Chrystal.
We're talking about numbers, right? You don't think they have enough numbers to be effective in the streets, but they don't need numbers in the streets to be effective. They just need an effective ideology, right? So like Lauren said, they're no longer wearing red hoods. They're wearing red caps and polo shirts. And so when a random person on the street is able to ram through a whole street of protesters because he just was driving by and decided, I can't speak to his mentality, but what's happening, the violence that's happening is happening daily, right? It's happening on a state level, it's happening on a street level, it's happening on a community level. And so the ramping up of the violence is indicative of their power, right? And it's indicative of the fact that it will take very little for their small numbers to gradually increase. And so let's nip this problem in the bud before it gets to 5,000 people and 10,000 people in the streets. People are dying every single day from some type of violence. 9 mosques every month are attacked. There was one that was recently bombed in Minnesota, one in Palm Springs, in Santa Barbara. The one in UC Davis is constantly getting vandalized or having pork thrown at it. I don't understand what their obsession with pork is. Throw it at whatever. It doesn't harm anyone. It's not kryptonite. But anyways, that's, another thing. But what I'm saying is we need to be vigilant in our opposition of this. We need to be out in the streets in massive numbers constantly. We can't lose our steam because the implementation of legislation that will remove our rights slowly but surely as women, as minorities, as everyday citizens is continuously rolling through. And that's what the media isn't paying attention to. That's what the media isn't highlighting. So the media is complicit in the governance that is happening right now. Don't let the CNN or Fox labels or MSN labels fool you. These corporations are all run by the same people who sit at the same table and eat together all the time and then laugh about, their ratings.
Right.
So their concern is their corporate sponsors. Their concern is not the truth. Their concern is not the rights of the American people. Their concerns are not for those who are currently experiencing degradation as we speak. But what their concern is helping to spread, messages, through complicity from President Trump all the way down to, Richard Spencer, Heil Hitler, Heil our people, or whatever he said. Heil victory, Heil our people, etc. That went viral. Like him making that call went viral, and people heard that and took that seriously. They took that as a call to arms. We didn't see Republicans en masse come out and condemn that. We didn't see even liberals come out en masse and condemn that. It was just like, oh my, what did he say in public? It's like, no, serious, severe condemnation, and distance yourself as much as possible. And this government doesn't do that. Explicitly or implicitly. Very, very few politicians in power right now have the courage to say what is actually necessary to confront this demonic power and to put it back in its place.
I did want to say that I do think that the media this time was better as far as not talking about Antifa and the counter protesters, because it's really interesting, and I want to get into the ACLU of Virginia, because I didn't realize until yesterday that they actually sued for them to be able to have this march. They were tweeting, and I got some very good video from the beginning of the march to the end, and they started to fixate on the fact that the counter protesters outnumbered the protesters, and the counter protesters were throwing things. And that's, how it started to go down on the ACLU of Virginia's Twitter page. But then, of course, when the car rammed into everybody, nobody was talking about Antifa anymore. So that was something that was a big story on the media in the protests and Occupy inauguration, was what these small group of more violent protesters did. And so they were able to take the attention away from the actual unhappiness with Trump's election. But in this case, this act was so egregious, and with even the Justice Department coming right out and saying they were going to investigate it as a hate crime. That's Jeff Beauregard Sessions, Justice Department said that. And so I thought that was kind of a good thing, that this is going to be investigated. But then we get back to this sort of lone gunman thing. Like they start investigating this guy and his past. And it just reminds me of what happens when there was Muslim terrorists. However, they have said that the white supremacist terrorist is twice the amount of Muslim terrorism in this country. So I thought that was also fair that they pointed that out. But what's going to happen is there's going to be more of these instances, because these people become like heroes or anti-heroes or something.
Here in Richmond, California, we overcame some of the worst case scenarios possible in politics, where millions upon millions of dollars were being spent by corporations like Chevron to try to control our city government and run us like a company town. And because we just knocked on doors and made phone calls, and hundreds of residents invested their people power, we got to reclaim our local government and become the first new rent control city in a generation. And so I think that's just a really important thing, that stories like that, including stories out of Seattle and other cities, out of Jackson, Mississippi, to continue to remind ourselves that, at this time, should we be psyching ourselves up for a civil war, or should we, again, try to cast that positive vision where if you invest your feet on the streets in protesting and knocking on doors and making phone calls, that actually will create results and actually will have a transformative impact on our country. Because I believe that we are in this place now because we haven't done the work of claiming democracy effectively. We've allowed for generations, really, for consumerism, for racism, for classism, for all the myriads of different social and economic factors and political regimes that our country has continued to decay in this version of neoliberal capitalism. And we can make the choice to be I think, really courageous and and bold, and make people feel like being involved is healthy, and being involved is something that happy people do.
Okay,
That healthy people
I gotta
do.
cut you off here because
Sure.
I don't disagree with you, and I do these things myself. But I really think that you are. I do have to say, and as someone who's been accused of speaking from white privilege, I've got to say, I think that's where you're totally coming from here, because you're not in a position where you're going to go out on the street and you're going to be attacked because of your skin color. And I want Chrystal.
That's correct. Yeah,
I want
absolutely.
Chrystal to come and speak about this because she has experience with her first march. And so you think we need to do something different. Tell us what you're doing.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The thing is you can talk about organizing politically when you're safe, right? When you're living in your secure town and you have coalitions of neighborhoods, on your side, and community organizations that you can work with. But what I've seen happen is at the last United for Love rally, which was in response to an Act for America anti-Muslim hate group rally that was put on across the country in 28 cities, we noticed that the police were actually more interested in attempting to barricade or blockade our group of anti-racist protesters, and they weren't protecting us from the Nazi KKK stormtroopers that were literally running at us, right? So they're running at us with sticks, with knives, with God knows what else in their pockets. We have no idea. And I had to consistently shout into the microphone, like, lock arms, pull in your ranks, do not engage. This is a peaceful, nonviolent action, do not engage. And because they saw us organize and react the way that we did, they didn't attempt to penetrate our defense. Now, they could have very easily done that and harmed many people, and the police would have let it happen. I mean, the police literally parted like the Red Seas in order to allow them to get through to us. So we have to dismantle white supremacy. We have to completely break it apart, break it down, and get rid of it from our society before we talk about banding together politically, before we talk about calling a senator or calling whomever. Like, there are people who don't have the luxury of doing that because their lives are in danger right now. Their livelihoods are in danger right now. Their children are in danger, and children are watching us. I had a little girl at the vigil last night asking why we're not helping to save Black people, and she's 6 years old. And she's asking us adults, like, why aren't you doing something to challenge this, to attack this, to dismantle this? I mean, we need to focus on that first. That is the root of all of this madness, this insanity. I fully believe that the fulcrum of white supremacy is anti-Blackness. Once we tackle that, we can tackle all the other problems we're facing societally, systemically, economically, socially, environmentally.
We have an incredibly racist and oppressive sheriff that is facilitating an ICE program that is deporting thousands of our neighbors right now. And a campaign is ongoing right now to get him out of office, right? And so,
and it took activists like decades to get rid of Sheriff Joe, right? So absolutely. I'm saying, like, the timing. It's like we need to do action now, immediately. Like, get people in the streets, get people out of their homes, go meet your neighbors, go to different communities, volunteer. We need to get to know one another. Don't rely on a system to solve this problem. Like, we need to connect with one another. I need to connect with you, and you need to connect with me, and we need to bring our people together in order to come up with, our plan of action. Like, get out in the streets, oppose these actions, oppose this fascism, because like Xochitl said, it took about 3 months before the establishment of, the Nazi regime to the establishment of Dachau. I mean, fascism creeps in and it, implements very, very quickly. The next Act for America rally is on September 9th. So I've organized United for Love 2, which is to, contradict their America First ideology. I mean, we want to bring Americans together of all backgrounds to say that the power of love is greater, the power of us in numbers is greater than this hate, and we will eradicate hate in our lifetime.
Now, you were telling me that you were worried that you're not going to get a big turnout. I mean, I even said Upland. Oh my God, that's so far. I never go to Upland.
Right.
And you said that they expressly located it there because they knew that the activist base probably wouldn't come out. So do you think that's intentional?
Well, yes, absolutely. They're very strategic in what they do, and they always choose an area of least resistance, a community that may not be aware of what they're planning. Just like when they arrived in San Bernardino, local people in the community were like, "Who are these people? Why are they here? What's happening?" They had no idea. So they show up in a community unannounced, in a sense, and they declare victory because the activists who are on the lookout for events like this are based in Los Angeles, they're based in major cities. And so, what I fear is that Los Angelinos, that, people in the Inland Empire, that people, who are within at least a 50 to 100-mile radius won't be aware of what's happening and won't show up to help defend the city because they chose to do it in Upland. I mean, this is a very far removed location from the majority or the locus of activists, in Southern California. So I'm hoping that this helps spread the word that September 9th, please show up if you're against racism, if you're against white supremacy, if you think that any of your rights as an American citizen are being harmed by this presidency and by this growth of this type of ideology, then please come and stand with us. And we are here to support all of our oppressed communities and to create the America that we can be proud of together.
Yes. Now, I wanted to talk about the police, because even where there are activists, and as I mentioned in Charlottesville, the left-wing counter-protesters definitely outnumbered the protesters. But as we saw, it just took one guy to make a horrible thing happen. So what you had there is a lot of reports that the police, and one of the ACLU tweets of the videos that they shot, these little 15-second videos, showed the clashes, between the protesters and the counter-protesters, with the police just sitting there. And they basically said they weren't going to intervene unless they were commanded to do so. And there was a lot of speculation that because this is Charlottesville, Virginia, the police department is very racist. And they really had no interest in protecting the counter-protesters. I shared something that someone I don't even know, this was a friend of a friend, his name is James Spioni. I shared it. It was shared 72 times from my share. And he said, lucky thing those Nazis didn't try something really dangerous, like stopping an oil pipeline, or they might have been met by a fleet of Humvees, hundreds of militarized police from 10 states, shadowy military contractors, attack dogs, MRAPs, rubber bullets, mace, tear gas, pepper spray, fire hoses, concussion grenades, LRADs, and a coordinated response from numerous federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. And of course, we all know they're talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline. So, that goes to your point about neoliberalism, Zak, because there you have the state basically defending a private corporation's right to extract our resource, and, harm the environment, poison the health of people, all for the sake of profit, even take property from it for using eminent domain for a private corporation that isn't even a U.S. corporation, TransCanada. But the point is, there's Standing Rocks all over the country. I mean, we have it here in California. We have the refinery up in Oakland. We have the refinery in Richmond, the refinery down here in Torrance. And we just witnessed Jerry Brown ram through in 2 weeks' time a cap and trade bill that he negotiated in secret with the oil companies that will make these problems worse. We really can't depend on the authorities to protect us from this. It really comes down to taking matters into our own hands. And quite frankly, Zak, with all due respect, I've given up on, even organizing, because I think that with the outside influence of money in politics, and yes, Bernie Sanders was able to run a campaign on $27 donations. And yes, the Richmond Progressive Alliance was able to beat back Chevron, even though they were outspent 20-1. That was an amazing thing. And you did that by good old-fashioned organizing. But on a national level, I just feel that the forces out there are so strong. I was inspired by the valve turners. These were people who are in their 60s and 70s who basically lined up on the U.S.-Canadian border, on the northern border, 5 different places where the valves were that turn on the pipeline, where the Canadian tar sands go down the pipelines, and they turned them off. 15 minutes before they turned them off, they called the authorities. Well, actually, they called the pipeline. They called TransCanada and said, we're going to turn these off. You may want to turn off your pipeline so they don't burst. They actually gave them the courtesy of a phone call. And then after they did it, they called the police and waited to be arrested. Now, some of these people are in for 40 years to life. I mean, these are, like I said, baby boomers, senior citizens, and they feel after a lifetime of organizing and writing their congressmen and having citizen lobby meetings that all of that is for naught. And this is what I think we have to do. I think we need mass, peaceful civil disobedience and really, stopping the machine by doing something like that. Your thoughts, Zak?
Well, first of all, I'm going to be first to say that I don't believe in lobbying legislators, really. I don't believe in I'm an electoral organizer, right? I believe in investing energy into campaigns that get citizen grassroots candidates elected to public office, people who don't take corporate campaign contributions. Because all of the issues that you just named, Lauren, are caused by politicians who take corporate money. And so we have 2 major parties in this country that are completely dependent upon corporate money and are both pro-war parties as a result of that. And so, in terms of, any kind of appeal for, believing that electoral organizing is an effective mode of change, I just want to call to the fact that electoral politics is actually very math-oriented, and that, what if I told you that it really only takes 30 of you and your neighbors to invest the energy to win city council seats in your town? And what if I told you that if you and your neighbors, take over your city council and you have corporate-free leaders who are really fighting for you and actually fighting for the interests of regular people, and then a neighboring town does it, well, now you have an assembly seat. And then you add a couple more towns, and then you have a congressional seat. In Richmond, it took us 10 years to go from, winning a mayor's seat and another seat, and then now we have a 5 out of 7 majority on the Richmond City Council that don't take corporate campaign contributions, and the other 2 take corporate campaign contributions, but not from Chevron or other, major, particularly toxic interests. This city used to be in the top 20 list of homicide cities in the United States. This community has gone through an incredible amount of harm and destruction and violence, and it really was able to transform itself because people came together, and mostly people of color, leaders of color in our community came together to organize to win these seats. And so we went from a police department that was an occupying force to one that still needs more work, but has been identified by many as a national model in community policing. Whenever I see protests sometimes, and again, I'm not dissing protests. I think that they are critical. And by the way, most of our constitutional amendments happened because of robust protest movements that took the streets nationwide. That said, if I see a rally of folks, I have to ask the question, can these people go and knock on some doors and actually identify voters? Because, I go out and I talk to people and I give them a very simple script. I say, these are the candidates running to represent us who take corporate money. These are the candidates running to represent us who don't take corporate money. And the vast majority of those conversations, people decide, what? I frankly trust the people who are only taking money from regular folks like me.
I've already shared my views on why I think he should be impeached. And I'd like to know what you 2 think.
I don't believe that impeachment will be effective at all. I think that those who have achieved these seats of power did so by nefarious means, and they're going to hold on to them by the skin of their teeth. Also, the system wasn't built for people like Donald Trump not to win. So unfortunately, he's the president for better or for worse. And I believe the only true way that we can see change is if we protest in the streets every single day continuously until they get the hint that we do not want Trump or Pence in power. And, like I was saying earlier, if by some miracle Trump were to be impeached, what does that leave us with? That leaves us with a storied, tried and true politician who knows exactly how to implement legislation, what time, what place, the strategy involved, the people that he needs on his side. And he's a savvy person. That is not someone that we shouldn't fear. That is someone that we should be shaking in our boots that could potentially rise to that seat of power. So no, I don't believe that impeachment is the solution. I think we need to get rid of the Trump-Pence regime.
We all know that the First Amendment does not allow you to shout. There's exceptions. You're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater because it can incite violence. So what do you think, Chrystal? Do you think that the ACLU should be protecting the rights of this horrible speech? Because the alternative is, who decides what's horrible speech? Because right now they could be stopping the Ku Klux Klan from speaking, but in the next moment they could be stopping a Muslim group from speaking.
Right. So this is now a question of legality. What does the law say, right? And what precedent do we have to ban hate speech? Now, I'm not going to say that I'm a legal scholar by any means, but in the UK, when it came to issues of domestic violence, when women would end up killing their husbands after years and years of abuse, she was incited to react, right? She was backed into a corner, years of abuse, etc. So hate speech, right? Hate speech is something that incites violence. And this is the type of speech that shouldn't be legal, period. This is a philosophical point of view. It's not a legal point of view.
I remember in 1978, I was interning. I was still in college. I was interning at a TV station. And I actually supported the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, Illinois, which was considered particularly heinous location because a lot of Jewish Holocaust survivors lived in that community. And I remember at the time, because I was a college student and studying the First Amendment and everything was very theoretical to me, supporting what the ACLU did, because my belief was that the best antidote to bad speech is good speech. And the thing to do would be to have a counter rally, call out the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith and have them do a counter rally. But my views were challenged by some millennials recently when it came to the issue of Milo Yiannopoulos, in Berkeley, because people were saying that he was doxing transgendered individuals, identifying them, outing them, and that could lead to violence. So,
which is an act of violence.
Yeah.
That is an act of violence.
Yeah. Just in terms of naming what seems to be his pattern, his rhetorical pattern, is to, say inflammatory, awful, violent things. And then wait for anyone on the left, whether they're organizers or leaders or just, so-called, rank and file or, more regular people to respond to him in such a way that does not exactly match his argument or what he was saying. And then that would give him the ability to then turn around and see, these guys are idiots. They can't even engage in a real debate with us, right?
The Kellyanne Conway tactic, right?
Exactly.
But what's really interesting about this is it's the way they're doing it. They're basically saying that these university, because what's happening is it's these conservative societies, and we all know that the Koch brothers and ALEC and all these other right-wing groups have been funding these things in universities. So they pay for Richard Spencer to go. They pay for Milo to go. And it's very hard for, a grassroots a university student organization to afford to bring someone in, of that caliber to counter the person.
Free speech doesn't refer to institutions or people on the streets or, organizations having a certain defined set of parameters or guidelines or sets of behavior to follow or protocol. for what type of speech is allowed among their people. Free speech is about the government not interfering in your right to exercise free speech. So when these conservative groups make this big hullabaloo about they weren't allowed at a university, sorry, nobody guarantees that you're allowed to speak at a university. No one guarantees that if you're shouting in a microphone on the streets, that someone else with a bigger microphone isn't going to come and shout even louder. So let's define what free speech really, or let's rehash what the definition of free speech is. And then when they make these erroneous arguments, call them out on it.
This refusefascism.org, which is the organization that Xochitl works with, they are having a meeting on August 19th. And it's an organizing conference to plan for November 4th. And the organizing conference is called "This Nightmare Must End. The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America." So who should attend this conference? Students and youth, the faith community, representatives of organizations, and people who are unaffiliated, artists and professionals, longtime activists, and folks who have never protested before. So what they're organizing for is November 4th, take to the streets and public squares. And they're having these meetings in New York, Austin, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco.
Really where we are is in a moment where we have to make a decision about how this country is going to go forward. If we are going to allow the state to consolidate what everyone can see is, to me, a fascist regime, or at the very least an authoritarian white supremacist regime. And the only way that we're going to actually stop this is by people coming together in the streets, like we did at the inauguration, but staying in the streets. And so November 4th is called for a national day of beginning, of bringing out thousands of people who will grow to tens of thousands, who will grow to millions, who will take the streets and hold the streets. Our goal and our intention is nothing less than driving out the Trump-Pence regime. And as I got to say before earlier in the podcast, we don't believe that there's any resolution for us other than the people doing this. And when we can actually recognize that, then that will liberate us to actually be able to solve this. But waiting on anything else is really going to lead us down a further course of what we saw yesterday and the day before in Charlottesville, and a growing, emboldened, more powerful ultra-right wing, and an increasingly powerful Trump administration that is going to and has been carrying out one of the most brutal and repressive regimes we've ever seen in the history of this world, really, outside of some of the atrocities we saw in Germany and other places. But I want to call on folks from wherever you are, from whatever political perspective. You don't have to be a revolutionary. We were out there today with tons of folks who voted for Bernie and Hillary, folks who didn't vote at all. There were some of the anarchist kids out there, communists out there. Tourists joined us in the streets in the Castro and in the Mission. We were out there with tons of white folks and black folks, and Latinos. This is a movement for everybody. And if you are disgusted, in the words of Heather, if you woke up in the morning and you realize that you can't take one more second, that you realize that if you are not completely disgusted and outraged, then you're not paying attention, in her words, then you have to do something. And that something is joining organizations. Go to refusefascism.org, come to the organizing meeting on August 19th in your areas, and definitely make plans for November 4th to be out in the streets.
Thank you so much, Xochitl. I put your website in there. Keep fighting, okay?
All right, I will. Thank you, guys.
Okay. And Chrystal, we've got your website, or I should say your link to your event in there.
Yes. Please use the hashtag United4Love2 to posting the link to the event in the comments below.
Great.
Oh, and please find me on social media at Yes, I'm Chrystal K, CRYSTALK.
Great. Thank you. And Zak, finally to you. Appreciate your point of view.
Thank you so much. And anyone who's interested in Jovanka Beckles and her corporate-free campaign for California Assembly, please go to jovanka.org. That's JOVANKA.org.
Thank you very much, and keep fighting.